So it's nice to see or be with everyone. Thank you very much for your time in attending in today's workshop. We're going to be looking at decolonising through reflexive practice, and I've got a kind of little tag there of where are we now, because I presented an earlier version of this work a couple of years ago in the first Birmingham City University Decolonising Academic Practice series, and B, also at the University of Salford, where I work, we have been working in different ways on decolonising, both in the business school where I'm situated and the wider university, and it's a bit of that journey and some of the changes. This presentation will talk about and explore the development of this Decolonising through Reflexive Practice series, from an initial concept and resource through to what is now structured academic professional development, and an e-course. And I'll be kind of showing you a bit of what that looks like and how that works in the presentation. Looking as well about what I think are the benefits and some of the feedback we've received from this approach, but also considering some of the limitations. It is a 90-minute session or thereabouts, so it's a bit of a long one, and so I do apologize if I speak for too long, and I do apologize. We are going to have a couple of breakout rooms, one at the beginning and one towards the end, and feel free to put any questions in the chat, and they should be kind of captured, and at the end of it we should have like a 15-minute Q&A session, so hopefully be able to get to all of those questions as well. There's also a Padlet link in the second breakout room activity. Not a huge Padlet task, just a couple of things that I would like you to engage with. In terms of the session today, I'm going to just go through a bit of a background about who am I and how I break that identity down a little bit and how that ties into decolonising work. We'll step into the initial breakout activity, and then I'll recap for you the 2022 delivery of the BCU session and kind of a bit of what I covered, so you understand the context and the journey. And then look at what's changed between then and now, 2 years on. I'll then go into the e-course and the institutional pilot that I'm leading at the University of Salford this year, and that some of the work we've done with students as well. I'll touch on the evaluation aspect, because I think it's really important. We do try to evaluate these initiatives, which is not always easy. And then we'll have another breakout room activity. Then I'll go into the limitations, I think, of decolonising, and things we may need to consider, and then Q&A and wrapping up the session. Okay, so you have a bit more of an understanding of who I am. Personally, I am a father and a husband. I'm Arab ethnically and Muslim. I've lived probably about half of my adult life in the UK and half outside the UK, but I was born and raised in London and those and down south. I now live in Greater Manchester. I consider myself male, and I am in terms of my value system, they're very much kind of family centered, and the importance of family and that prioritization. And that does tie in as well to my connection to decolonising, being from the Middle East, and obviously those countries are still impacted by colonial rule even today. And then also, I think, being a father in the UK to Arab children, or British children, but British Arab children, and that consideration of identity and what it means. And even now, when my oldest is in primary school, and some of the questions he comes back and is asking me about, and they are better than when I was at school, but it's still that consideration of thinking about what is an education that is fit for him as a member of this community and society. Professionally, I see myself as an academic, but I work in a business school, but I'm not a business academic. My academic background is in education, learning and teaching. I'm the academic student success lead in the business school. I'm also an inclusivity lead, and then I am currently an institutional lead for the pilot of the decolonising e-course and resource that I've developed. Prior to that, I was teaching and lecturing in English and academic skills and research skills in the Middle East for about, I can't remember now, about 8, 9 years, I think. And I've been back in the UK since 2019 and working at the University of Salford. My, as I said, my background, academic background is in education, learning, and teaching. My views on education center around the need for education to be around social justice and liberation, a force for change. Um, for me, education is intrinsically tied to activism. I find it hard to separate true education and learning and knowledge without that call to action and to be agents of positive change. Thinking about who our students should be when they graduate from our institutions, I don't think it should just be about getting a job and the graduate outcomes aspect. Whilst I understand the importance of that, obviously for our students, I would like to see that they become change agents in society. Reflection in relationship to decolonizing. So, personally, and professionally and academically, my views around these areas tie very much into this the decolonizing work. And I think decolonizing is important for me because, as it will be for many of us in the room, um, because it offers that approach to critically review existing structures beyond other EDI work or EDI work in general. I personally, although we often bring decolonizing under the EDI umbrella because of alignment and budget and all sorts of things like that, um, I don't see decolonizing as particularly an EDI piece of work. And I think decolonizing education for everybody, staff and students, and just the wider institution society, it offers a critical approach to education where we actually review and consider the impact of those legacies of colonization on our society. But I do wonder whether I am actually doing it enough justice sometimes. Personal reflections for me, for example, thinking about Palestine currently and other countries of conflict, oppression, genocide, and war crimes, who are living through those crises. But and very much that ties into decolonization, and yet we don't seem to be talking about it too much. I was at a conference in London, and the keynote was Dr. Ghanem Singh, and he actually started the keynote by addressing this issue and calling this out. And I think it is important for me personally when I reflect on this. And I said I'm from that part of the world. I've got family from Gaza, and yet is it front and center of the decolonizing work? And it's not. And it's so I kind of challenge myself on that and other areas of conflict, as I said. And are we actually confident enough in tying our decolonial approaches to addressing where we stand academically on those issues? So it's a point of reflection for me, as it may be for others. But that's kind of who I am and how I um view my relationship to decolonizing, I guess. I will go into obviously the resource and everything a bit later. But before I do, I want to just do a bit of a breakout activity. I think 5 minutes is enough. It's just to kind of get you to reflect as well on who you are. So you're going to be put into groups of about 4 or 5 people. And I'm going to ask you just to identify 3 aspects of your identity and the role that it plays in your approach to engaging with or understanding decolonizing, and also ask you to consider whether you feel you are truly committed to the decolonizing work in all its ways, or whether there are aspects of your professional and personal values which you actually separate or hinder you from truly engaging in the decolonizing work. So those are the 2 main things I want you to discuss in your groups. And if you have time, just consider as well that question in the green box of do you think decolonizing is working, or are we failing decolonizing as a sector? So relatively big question if you have time just to kind of touch on that, depending on how quick you go through the others. So 5 minutes. So we should be back here by just after 12:20, back into the main room, please. I think people are starting to filter back in. So I think it was about 5 or 6 minutes. It wasn't a huge amount of time. I appreciate that, but hopefully it was a bit of a time to introduce yourselves to each other and just consider some of the aspects of your identity that factor into your approach to engaging with your understanding of decolonizing work. Obviously, there are different perspectives and understandings of this, and they range from, you know, linking it to wider EDI, and more around the views of diversification, all the way through to kind of really critical decolonial approaches to disciplines practice and questioning whether, you know, we can even operate in considering the structures that we have in institutions. And I think I sit around the middle of those areas. I am curious to know though if you could maybe put answers in the chat as you wish to, or even on mute. But I mean, what are your thoughts on the idea of whether decolonizing is working? I'm not sure of people's experiences, knowledge, and what you're leading on or working on around decolonizing. But you know, obviously there have been many conferences for a few years now, around this work, and actually, you know, obviously publications and papers and people working in this area for a few decades. Do you think decolonizing is working, or do you think that as a sector we are not quite doing it justice? Just curious of your kind of thoughts on that before we move on. Certainly not in your institution, okay. And do you think then that is due to will and desire, resource, expertise, or a kind of combination of those factors?
I'm gonna. Can you hear me?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, because I can't get my camera to work strangely. But just to answer that question, I think it's a combination of everything. At the moment, there's a lot of financial strain at our university, probably at most universities at the moment, and everything, all priorities is about money. I feel so, and everybody is overworked, and everybody is pushed to the limit, and for many people, this feels like just, you know, kind of just one more thing that even though they might like to engage with it, they just simply can't because it's all just too much at the moment. But even if we did all have a little bit more time and brain space, I don't feel like there's really support from management. Everything is very much kind of. Sorry, this is recorded. I don't know how much I should say about my institution here.
So that's, it is recorded, and I think they had the privacy. Yeah, but I mean, obviously, is as you're comfortable with. And you know, from my side, you're not saying anything that isn't probably true of many institutions, or even wrong. I think it's just your perspective and your experience as well. But yeah, I think resource, time that's always a big factor, and when it is considered an additional task, I think that's where we also start to struggle. So the more we can embed it centrally into practices and processes, the better it is for everybody. It's kind of part of who we are. I'm also starting to see in my institution that whilst the word decolonizing isn't always attached to things, there are principles of strategies or processes which I'm reading or listening to, um, institutionally, and there are principles of decolonizing I can feel, from my side, that I can see those elements that I would want the decolonizing work to lead to coming through. So even if it's not a direct result of some of the decolonizing work, I think there are culture shifts and there are discussions that take place that maybe have effects that we're not aware of as well. I can see a couple of things in the chat as well. So it's working to some extent, but not more to be done. Excellent. Yeah, the point around society and the workplace, absolutely relevant. Sometimes it's not necessarily about our institution, but you know, are we operating in a bubble, and then our students are going to be living in a world outside of that. So yeah, the terms being referred to, yeah, it's a yeah, lots of interpretations of decolonizing, and I have had a few conversations with colleagues and with people who said, well, do we have to call it decolonizing? Can't we call it something else? And whilst I get the sentiment, I also think that it's starting at the wrong point, by even considering renaming the work, personally, I feel that we have already acknowledged where the power lies, and that's where it's going to stay. Because if people are saying, well, I'm not comfortable with this, I want to change the name, and we do that, we've already kind of failed before we started in that sense, when we consider power dynamics and aspects of liberation and change. I'm going to move on, it's conscious of time, and I want to make sure we do have a nice Q&A. But thank you for that, both in terms of the breakout rooms and the response to the question there. So just considering then about why start, thinking about when I first started this work, in terms of creating the resource. So I've been looking around decolonizing aspects of different reasons, and again, some of the work I was doing when I was teaching abroad, linked to aspects of decolonizing without me actually realizing it, many years ago. But then I got to the point where I think there were lots of checklists floating around decolonizing, some really excellent work coming out of institutions like UCL and SOAS and others. And then obviously, given the nature of who we are as a sector, we that knowledge was shared and those checklists were shared, and toolkits rather than checklists, I guess, and really valid. But I always found that toolkits are not necessarily the way forward for me, because it's the end result, and all of the work that went into creating that toolkit, all of that institutional understanding and learning and collaboration, it wasn't seen in other institutions if you just take the toolkit, if you just take the final approach. But in terms of sharing practice and what things could look like, quite useful. In terms of applying them, not so much. So I started thinking, okay, what could we do? And a lot of colleagues in higher education are familiar with the concept of development, of reflective practice, and the need to reflect. Anyone who's done any kind of postgraduate certificate in higher education or academic practice will also be familiar with these, or and you'd hope that many professions as well, from HR through to healthcare, have aspects of reflective practice embedded in the discipline itself. So I thought, let's build from that. And I do think as well that decolonizing work needs to start with the individual and with the academic before we go into reading lists and content. So all of that aligned very nicely. And I looked at this idea of reflexive practice and how decolonizing could be delivered through this way. And I created a resource, which was literally a PDF. And then we looked at how to kind of deliver it to some colleagues. And originally it was like shared as an independent learning resource. And then there was some feedback of, well, okay, I would like to be able to talk about this, and how do I apply this? What's the context for my discipline? And there was some assumption on my part as well that, familiarity with terms like critical pedagogy and critical race theory were commonplace, and they're not in all disciplines. So I took a step back and I thought, okay, we've got this resource I've created now, this PDF resource. What do we do with it? Let's not just leave it out there. Let's try and build something around it. So we looked at doing some work with teams and colleagues in the business school where I sit under my inclusivity role. And we started with that. And in 2022, that was what my presentation was about, essentially, at this Birmingham City University Decolonising Academic Practice series. And on this slide, there is a link to the BCU YouTube channel for that conference. If people haven't seen it, you'll be able to see loads of really interesting and amazing work that came out the conference 2 years ago. And that link to my slide, just to have a bit of context if you wanted to, and look at my presentation there. So that's what I kind of covered, the approach a couple of years ago, some takeaways, thoughts, some initial feedback. And what the resource looked like 2 years ago was this. It was a PDF. So we had the 5 areas of the guide, this PDF resource, and that had content which looked like stuff like this. So some quotes, some questions, some text, and then there was like at the end, like a checklist at the end, just as a prompt of, have you done this? Have you taken this away? Have you kind of understood this? And then there was the activity sheet of the reflective questions, which meant to help colleagues with some autonomous development and learning, and reflecting on their own identity, practice, discipline, and relationship with their discipline, whilst looking at the legacies of colonization that may have come through that and impacted who they are as an academic, and then obviously how they teach, and what they teach. So that's what we had a couple of years ago, and it did look very much like this. And it's a nice starting point, and we shared it. And Tran's work around a track model, which broke Decolonising down into teaching, relationship, activity, and assessment and content, was really useful to help colleagues understand that it goes beyond the reading list. And again, tying very much into that questioning approach of the self. However, we have moved on since then, and that's what I want to talk about today. So I used that resource, and I was supported very much by my leadership team, my lovely and amazing leadership team in Southwood Business School, who understood the value of engaging with this work, but also understanding that you're not going to get an immediate result of eliminating inequity straight away, which was really nice, because I think you do need that support in order to be able to deliver this. So with that support in mind, and with colleagues who are willing to engage and listen and be a bit open-minded, we managed to go through all of our subject groups and deliver, with that kind of PDF resource, workshops alongside it. So colleagues should engage in the units, unpack the reading, consider some self-reflection, and then come into a workshop where we could try and contextualize it a little bit, for their discipline areas, for their identities, and what that meant. And we were able to do that across the business school. And that led to me thinking, okay, what do we do next with this? And it is just a PDF. What can we do next? And so I managed to get funding again from my university leadership this time, via the Associate Pro Vice Chancellor for EDI, who was interested in funding this and seeing what we could do institutionally with this. So I'd asked, and I put in a proposal to create an e-course, to move away from just people having to go through slide after slide or page after page of a PDF. And we managed to do that, and we worked with an external partner, because I'm not particularly techie myself, to create this interactive e-course. And then that was run through our equity areas as an institutional pilot, and that's the work I've been leading on this year. And I was able to deliver, and I have been able to deliver that pilot both to staff, some groups of staff, and a group of students, and offer it to a group of students, with, honestly speaking, mixed results. And then we've been able to kind of pull out some of my own reflections and some evaluations. And I'll touch on that a bit more as I go through. So the reason why I shifted from that PDF resource to an e-course is I think we'd all appreciate, having to go through page after page of a PDF document is not particularly engaging, especially this heavy content and what we're asking people to do. And I wanted to make it something which was a bit more standalone, but also had inbuilt support and was interactive. And so this idea of an e-course sat well with me. I think it offers a more sustainable approach as well, in terms of how we can carry forward the decolonising work. And I was able, because it is an e-course, I was able to deliver aspects of it, and expand on the written content through like an audio podcast type narrative as well. So the e-course has, if you think about what the original resource was a couple of years ago, it was, as I said, a PDF with an accompanying activity sheet, and checklist at the end that the colleagues would work through. The e-course now, it sits in Blackboard as a module or program would, and it's made up of 5 interactive workbooks that make up the entire course. And what it has that the other one does, so aside from just that in and of itself being a lot better, it's got contributions from others. So I've been able to have recordings built in with conversations with people who have engaged with decolonising work or who are leading decolonising work. So people who are participants of the course can hear from other perspectives and other experiences. I was able as well to then have a narrative approach and kind of like almost like a podcast feel, where I'm talking through and expanding on some points and contextualizing it and giving examples. And then we're able to add imagery and some interaction and interactive aspects as well. The institutional pilot was an idea that, okay, we've run a version of this in the business school. We chose a subject group to run the pilot with the new e-course to see the difference between perspectives of the e-course versus the old resource, if you like. But then we wanted to run that across, and we have 4 schools in the University of Salford, and so we have chosen a subject group in each school that we can work with in this academic year to get them engaged and enrolled on the e-course, complete the 5 workbooks, and then deliver two half days, a full day, whatever it is, academic development around that, which builds on the learning from the e-course, but then offers opportunities to kind of push it, how that looks in in a particular discipline area. It allows colleagues to then come as like a peer learning aspect, to engage and challenge each other, challenge me and challenge the work as well. And then colleagues are asked to kind of give a bit of feedback, and then we'll be doing a qualitative evaluation study at the end. So that's the kind of the pilot, and built into that as well was, finally, I was very happy that the pilot offered the resource and time. And I know somebody just mentioned this about this being so important, but by having it as an institutional pilot, it allowed me the resource and time to actually engage with students in this work. And thinking about a couple of years ago when I presented, I don't know if it's here or in another conference, but there was a friendly challenge and criticism, if you like, saying, well, this is very much around the academics. What about the students? And I do acknowledge that the e-course itself, the work that I lead on and contribute to, is around the academic, right? That's not to say students don't have a voice, but I've got specific reasons why I haven't usually engaged with students, and I'll mention them in a minute. But this pilot allowed me the chance to do it in a way that I was comfortable with, and build students into that conversation. So that's kind of what the difference is, and the shift there. The e-course itself it looks like this. So I've got a couple of, I'm not sure how, hopefully you can see this. So these are 2 images side by side. Anyone who's got Blackboard or uses a similar VLE is going to understand, this is what it is. A bit of a squashed image, so I do apologize. So the image on the right, where it says Decolonising through Reflexive Practice, that's the landing page for the e-course housed on Blackboard as a site. And you can see, like, the course information. There's obviously a reading list attached that's fed into the e-course, but also other things which I think people might want to read around decolonising work. There are closed discussion spaces that are built into this as well, which are private, and because it's housed on Blackboard, I can put all of the different pilot groups into groups on Blackboard and then close them off. And then have the discussion areas only for that group as well, which adds a level of comfort and I guess safety for colleagues to engage with people in their own pilot without having to deal with everyone else who might be working on or being involved in that across the institution. And then the workbooks are literally built in as units essentially, and then there is an external link after you click on it that takes you out to the workbook. And you can see on the left in the image, workbook 1, workbook 2, etc., going through. And the way we've set this up as well is that you can't just jump into workbook 2, 3, 4, or 5. You have to go through sequentially. So you have to complete workbook 1 before workbook 2 opens, workbook 2 before workbook 3, and so on. And that's to ensure that we do have some structure in how colleagues are engaging with the course. The course has been designed in a way that carries colleagues through that learning journey. And so this also helps colleagues to focus on one aspect before going on to the next. And what I've done here is kind of like a snapshot of what the e-course itself covers from workbook 1 to workbook 5. Each of them will start with an accessibility statement and end with the relevant guided reflection questions, which I would like, at the end of every workbook, I want colleagues to actually take something away and apply that to their learning based on this workbook. And that comes in the form of guided reflections, where they ask to contextualize and take this away and internalize that in terms of their own personal reflections as an academic, whether it's about identity and kind of culture, whether it's about content and discipline or relationships or anything else. So the first one, as you may expect, is quite introductory, and it kind of gets through the understanding of the impact of colonization itself, linking then into decolonising in education and different approaches, where to begin around that decolonisation of practice rather than content, and then introducing them to trans track model, which, as I said, I think is a really nice way of breaking things down into different areas and providing some initial questions for colleagues to start with in that as they begin that decolonizing journey. As we step into workbook 2, I build on this idea of reflexive practice and how that links into the decolonizing approach that we're looking at. Bring that back to identity is kind of similar to how I started with today, and the importance of recognizing identity, because part of identity obviously would be then tackling our own privileges, whether it's white privilege, male privilege, or anything else, and understanding the impact of that, where that privilege stems from, why we have that privilege in certain societies and roles and areas, and obviously then recognizing who doesn't have that privilege and what that means. And so it touches on those areas which we know can be uncomfortable. And then it goes into this idea of decolonization and intersectionality. And obviously we can't cover all of that in one workbook, but it introduces it and contextualizes it in a particular idea. Apologies for all of these problems. I have turned all of my apps off, but they are persistent, it seems. Workbook 3 is a shorter one, and then we kind of step into the decolonizing of pedagogy and the learning experience as the two main focus areas of workbook 3. And the reason why that's not straight away into workbook 1 is because I think we need that background, we need that starting point of identity before we ask people to go and really consider what this means in terms of their pedagogy and the students' learning experience in the discipline. Workbook 4 then pushes things a little bit further and asks colleagues to consider power dynamics, connections, trust, relationships. And that's quite challenging, I think, because we all want to think that we're doing the right thing for our students, and we are having, we try to create relationships with our students, we try to create the best experience for our students. But actually, when you apply that in a decolonizing lens of challenging those relationships and those structures and how we deal with our students, and at the assumptions we may make, and that the idea of how we might try to manage power dynamics again and those biases that may come through, it can challenge us, and what we think was right or has been beneficial. When you actually sit with that for a while and reflect on it, sometimes there have been those realizations for colleagues when they realized, okay, this is not working for some of my students or all of my students. And then the last workbook unpacks and recontextualizes decolonizing around other aspects that feed into this, whether it's social constructivism, critical race theory, and then building on the idea of, okay, what does decolonizing practice look like, and how can we then use this as a vehicle of liberation, and then it wraps it all up in terms of next steps. And as I said, at the end you've got guided reflection activities with specific questions tying into aspects and topics covered in each workbook that colleagues are expected to sit with before they go on to the next workbook. But because it's an e-course and because it's structured in this way, there is that autonomy of how long you take. And I tend to say the e-course itself needs about 10 hours of kind of time dedicated to go through it. And then, you're going to need your own individual reflection to sit with that. And then we have the workshops added on. So for colleagues to engage meaningfully in this work, as a starting point, and bearing in mind this is all just the foundation, isn't it? It's kind of getting colleagues to the point of knowledge, awareness, reflection, and asking the right questions, if you like, as well as signposting and scaffolding some of that work for them. But it's still that foundational aspect. We're not saying at the end of this you've decolonized your discipline, if you completely decolonize yourself. It doesn't work like that, as I'm sure you will know. But yeah, even as the foundational activity, we're looking at up to 30 hours of work. And so we do need that to be recognized. And we're very transparent with colleagues as we're going into the pilot that this is what we're expecting, right? But we're also flexible, right? How many weeks and months do you want to have to engage with the e-course? And so you can manage it around your work. Can we build a workload allocation into that so it kind of recognizes it? And can we work with line managers to support that? And then also thinking about, right, the time you're going to need to digest the e-course before we step into like a couple of half days of academic development workshops to revisit that content and look at what it means for you in your subject group or your discipline or your department. So that's what we have now, a couple of years on, and where we've got to. I'm going to show you what the e-course itself looks like. So if just as a reminder, this is what the PDF was like, with those kind of essentially like PowerPoint slides put into an ebook, if you like. The e-course, it looks a bit more like this, right? So you're engaging through. So it's the e-workbook. So you've got your menu on the side for your chapters or for your sections, and then we've taken things out. So where we've had, for example, a quote, which would just be like that. Then if you could see in the white boxes, just like you'd have a quote as a point of kind of reflection of something from the literature. In the e-workbooks, the way we do that is to build in some animation, to build in some images, to kind of present the meaning in a different way, and make it just a bit more engaging as well for colleagues. So these are some of the images and some of the quotes and what the workbook looks like. There are text aspects here, so we still have that text, so colleagues do have to read through, and you can see on the right an example of what that text looks like and how they may be able to go through. But again, it's a lot more comfortable to be able to scroll through text in an e-course and have it broken up by images and things than it is with the just like page after page. We have aspects of resources that are built in, as you can see from the image on the top left, with direct links built into the e-course, so you understand what the resource is, but also then you can click on the link and just go to it straight away. And in the bottom right, sorry, no, bottom left, apologies, you can see that kind of box, the blue box with the different white boxes in. And that's where we have the embedded podcasts, conversations, and narratives, and me expanding almost like mini seminars with some of that. So as well as like reading the text on the side, there would be a piece afterwards where I am talking through that and providing different examples and expanding on that, or where I've invited other people to have a conversation about this area. And so you can directly click into the audio file in the e-course, and then use the boxes around note taking and capturing ideas before you move on. So these are some of the aspects that it looks like. Play this video. So I've given you a bit of an insight into the structure of the e-course, how we run it, and what it looks like. I've just got like I think it's about an 8-minute video, so bear with me. But I've kind of recorded myself going through the e-course as well in different ways to give you a bit more of an idea of what that looks like, if you were to engage with it and get a feel for it as well. So I'm going to play that now, and give you a bit of an insight into how colleagues may be engaging with this. The e-course. Okay, so I just want to apologize for a couple of things. One is that obviously as I recorded that, I was listening to myself thinking, oh, I've repeated this, so you have to listen to some of that twice. But also, it was very late at night because I have a young child, and that was the best time I could find to actually record that. But I think the video gives you a bit of an idea again of accompanying the images, but what it looks like for colleagues and how the resource works and how we've tried to make it more dynamic and capture different areas to suit different learners and different colleagues, and just make it more engaging, because there's nothing worse than people switching off from the first couple of slides. So that's essentially the e-course and where we got to, like 2 years on, in terms of resource, in terms of implementation. But there are still challenges. Some of you mentioned this earlier on. Even though we have had resource allocation to deliver this, as I've mentioned, to pay for the e-course and to create it, and then for my time to deliver it as a pilot across the university, that it still takes a lot of resource of colleagues engaging with it, where workload, the commitments are pushing against things, but also around different commitments as well. So timeframes and the ability to commit to different things is really hard. You've got marking, you've got shift from trimester 1 to trimester 2, etc., etc. So you have those kind of competing priorities, and buy-in is a huge one, right? Just contextualizing for people, like why are we doing this? why decolonizing? Why not inclusivity? Why not X, Y, and Z? So that explanation of this. So I am working with colleagues and allies in different schools, such as Ursula and others, to meet with people prior to them joining the pilot itself as a subject group to explain what the pilot is, what the content is, what decolonizing is, and why we're doing it, rather than just chucking them in and saying, oh, you're in a pilot now. So there's that element of collaboration and communication to ensure that buy-in from the very beginning. And again, that's come out with mixed results, if I'm honest. But it has had a positive impact in colleagues feeling like this is not something being done to them, but there is a conversation around it and an explanation. So when they do log on to the e-course and start that work, there's a bit more of that buy-in already. Communication is key as well. And then thinking about timeframes and milestones and managing this is a project of, when are we going to deliver to different subject groups, students, evaluation, etc. But the challenge of that is those milestones is higher education. We all know it. So milestones will shift, priorities will come in, people's time changes. And so meeting and keeping those timeframes and milestones becomes a challenge for a pilot that's kind of ring fenced for a certain amount of time. So there are challenges in managing that buy-in, managing that commitment and time. But we've been, I think, moderately successful, at the moment. And we're coming to the end of this pilot now because it's 23-24 that we launched this. The other thing I wanted to mention, I'm just conscious of time, so I've got about 11 minutes left, which is probably exactly the right amount of time before I move on to the Q&A. But one of the criticisms I'd had previously when I've delivered presentations and conference presentations using the old resource, but even now with this it's very staff focused, right? And actually a key aspect of decolonizing should be about bringing the students along in the journey. Liberating knowledge and power dynamics would be about pulling the students in along that journey, not just co-creation, because I think that's a term that gets banded out, but recognizing the role of education for students and learning for students and what that is. But what had always stopped me from bringing students in straight away is whenever you speak to academics who are, whether you're a new academic who's come off masters in teaching practice or PhD, or whether you academic who's been there for 5, 10, 20, 30 years, a lot of the starting point is saying, I don't know what this is, I need time to digest it, I need some scaffolded professional development, I need resource, I need content, you need to show me how this works, I need material, right? Now if your experienced academics are saying that, then why are we expecting an 18-year-old straight out of a BTEC or an A-level course to be an expert on decoloniality? When the education system they've been through is not preparing them for that. So I've always struggled with that. The amount of work that students, if you're looking at co-creation on a project and content creation without paying them, that's another issue again, about exploitation and power, which for me is just contrary to this. And I know there have been some really good examples in the sector, both in the UK and outside the UK, where they've managed to make that work. But for me, because it is academic practice and it's about reflexive practice for the academics, I never wanted to just rush the students in. But this pilot provided the resource and the opportunity for me to run a separate program for students. So the students weren't linked to the as you can appreciate from the e-course and how it's focused, it's for staff. And so I created something slightly different for the students. I created a 4-part seminar series, and you can see in the table on the side what those seminars covered. So that introduction to decolonizing and unpacking it, empowering the student voice and decolonizing the student voice, because I think there's often a misunderstanding that if you have student voice in the room, you're meeting some of those principles of decoloniality. Well, you're not at all, because you can have students in the room who never speak, or you can have students in the room who are those same students who are always engaged and only representing a 5% of your student population. So that doesn't, just by having a voice doesn't mean you're actually empowering or decolonizing. So what we did in that was also challenge the frameworks and get students to critically review the student voice frameworks and whether they worked. And it's interesting in that seminar, I remember, because some of the students in the room were course reps. So they were thinking they're already doing this, but going through that seminar and breaking some of that down and challenging some of those perceptions, if you like, through to decolonizing point of view and principles, and applying those, they kind of realized that the structures we have, whilst they are comfortable, they're not aligned, I don't think, to a decolonizing approach. So what would need to change as well was the output of that seminar. We then looked at their learning experience so they could reflect on the modules they've studied that academic year, apply some of that decolonial learning we'd had in the seminars and some of those principles, and then think, okay, what could it look like? But it was also really interesting because they could pull out pockets where their academics and their module leaders had done aspects of this or had applied aspects of this without knowing it really. And again, that happened to me, a decade or so ago when I was teaching abroad, and reflecting on it, I think, well, I used to do this, but I didn't do it structured or consistent, and I wasn't unpacking it myself. So it's almost by accident that we fall into some of this good practice around decolonial work, without it actually being a piece of decolonizing. So they were able to identify where that happened, and then they were able to reflect on what was your impact from as a student, as a learner, in your engagement and understanding and knowledge creation when it was done like that compared to other approaches. And the final seminar we were able to look at with students, understanding and informing the teaching on your program from a decolonial. So what would it look like for students to then step into that space of change agents within their own program and course? Because it's all very well to talk about this from a passive kind of reflective point of view, but are they going to be empowered to contribute, to speak up, to make a change? And we were able to do that. Again, it was mixed, right? So this was a student pilot where we were asking students to contribute time additionally from their timetabled programs as part of this pilot. We did ring fence it, so it was only available to the programs, students on programs that we were doing the decolonizing work with the staff, so that we could do a bit of staff and student work on those areas. And we had, we had quite good engagement. But it's interesting, when I ran it with Health and Society, although the staff colleagues in Health and Society were amazing, a lot of them engaged with most of the e-course. They attended all of the workshops, they contributed, they challenged each other, challenged me. The students, it was my fault, again, talking about planning and milestones and those things shifting in terms of those challenges. I don't think we had enough time to map a proper pilot to their timetables in a way that would work for them. So we didn't get any engagement there. So I kind of closed the Health and Society one off. But for the Salford Business School one, it worked better against their timetables, and I was able to bring in students from both undergraduate and postgraduate, home and international, into a pilot group to attend those 4 seminars. And that was, so that was, I've always just kind of talked through some of the conversations and what we covered in those. But again, it shows that even when you've got resource and structure and this pilot approach, it's not always going to work. There will always be challenges. So there's a point of learning for me and for others. In terms of that evaluation, I know somebody mentioned in the chat about some evaluation. So evaluation comes in the different aspects of this, but it is built into the pilot approach itself. So on the one hand, I want feedback from on the e-course. On the other hand, I want it on the workshops themselves, and then obviously as perception. So there is an initial Microsoft Forms, which is like a soft form, which just is about just getting some initial feedback, anonymized, from one for students from their pilot and one for staff from their pilot. And then I'm going to be doing a qualitative study, unpacking it in more detail for participants as another aspect of the evaluation, and that will be happening towards the end of trimester 3, going into trimester 1 next year, where we'll be doing those kind of deeper interviews to get a better understanding from participants. In 22-23, remember I talked about the first BCU and the previous work I was doing that kind of led into this. We did get qualitative feedback, and I was able to do an initial study with them. Workload means I haven't quite finished writing it up yet this year, but it's on the way. But the initial kind of findings pulled from that feedback, even in the old PDF approach that we did, was that it was a positive experience. It was enjoyable, interesting, etc. You can see the slide for yourself. There were moments of awareness, so it's not like you're just constantly going second to second of self-realization, but there were those pockets of awareness and self-realization, those aha moments that kind of came through. There was definitely a request from the and a theme, actually, looking at the responses to that evaluation of the initial work, where people thought, okay, we had some workshops, we had the initial resource, we want more support, we want more workshops, we want more training, we want more access to that, which again is positive, because it shows colleagues awareness that it needs to be sustained and continuous. But it's not like they went through it and thought, oh, this is not for me. They recognize that there was benefit, but they just want more engagement and support through it. So that's something for me to take away and play around with. Some even, fed back that they think there needs to be mandatory for all colleagues to engage with, which was, again, really positive feedback. And then embedded in formal academic development as well. So things like PG Cap. And whilst the e-course is not tied to the PG Cap, I do deliver a guest lecture as part of our PG Cap course on decolonising. So we are trying to build things in, but there's always more that we could do. And then obviously there's you couldn't have feedback on something like this without a really valid point being made around support, time, resource, etc. But that was from the initial 22-23 work before the e-course. The e-course and the pilot I've just showed you and talked through, the staff feedback was that the vast majority of colleagues who fed back found that the workbooks were really engaging. The content was comfortable. So even though we were challenging things, and there's a piece where I talked about actually, okay, how do we apply this beyond this? So for example, EDI is not decolonising. An example of this is where you look at applying a decolonial lens to feminism. Okay, so where we're challenging some of those white lenses around feminism. We're critiquing, okay, who's feminism actually, and you're looking at decolonizing aspects of equity itself. So despite those being really difficult things to work with for some people, as well as points of privilege and questioning their own identity as an academic, the majority of people who fed back still felt they were comfortable with that content and the way it was put through the workbooks. That they did help them understand decolonising as a starting point, and what to take forward, and that the workshops helped them prepare a little bit more as well. They felt that the e-course and the workbooks in the e-course were well designed, and that the workshops offered an additional aspect to unpack it. So all the things I was hoping for came through some of the initial staff feedback around that. But there are still elements to improve around, for example, do we need to provide more opportunities to critique decolonising and discuss whether it's the right way, and then look at why it is the right way forward, etc. Some very brief and initial feedback from students were also that they enjoyed the seminars, that they learned a lot about decolonising education. Many of them not heard it before, or they thought that it meant something completely different, and they kind of came in with an open mind. And it's, the student seminars, as you may expect, were very different to the staff ones, and that was really interesting. By the end of seminar one, they realised that these were seminars and spaces where they could be extremely honest and frank. In a way, and that was what we needed the voice to be through those seminars. The majority of students who fed back wanted more of them, and actually they all wanted to see more of a decolonising approach in a structured way in their modules. So whilst I said that they were able to reflect on and pick out pockets where aspects of this had happened in their journey, they felt that they wanted more consistency aligning to some of the stuff that we'd unpacked in those seminars. So from the student point of view, again, really positive, which was nice. If you want to hear more about the student experience of decolonising, as one of the things I run in my role as inclusivity lead in a business school, I have started this year a podcast called Belonging in a Business School Life at Salford, where I have staff and students on to unpack various things around belonging. We've published about 8 or 9 podcasts so far, but there is one that I'm releasing next week, which is an episode where I invited a couple of students from the decolonizing seminars that I ran with them to talk about that. So if you are interested in hearing more from the students themselves, I should be releasing that next week on the Spotify channel. It is free, and I've put the link there. And of course, if you want to listen to any of the other episodes that are not decolonizing related, you can, please follow that podcast. But I thought it might be nice for you to kind of hear from the students themselves there. And so whenever you get these slides, you can follow me on LinkedIn, and I'll show you the link. But anyway, that podcast will be released. It's on my to-do list, and I hope you enjoy listening to that and hearing from the students themselves. Now, I did have another activity, but I'm very conscious of time. And I don't think that I'm going to be able to do this, if I'm honest, because I do want to provide an opportunity for Q&A. What I would say, though, is that the other activity was essentially getting your input. So having listened to me talk for a very long time, and I apologize for that, but hopefully seeing what we've done and what we're trying to do and some of that feedback, I wanted your feedback and input as well, to see how you might use this as an e-course in your institution. If you had access to a resource like this, how would you use it? How would you want to be used in your institution? That's question one. Question two is kind of getting your input into how you think that I could use it more, or we could use it more in my institution. So what I'm going to ask is, we won't do the breakout room aspect of this. What I would like to ask you to do is, there is the QR code and there is the link to the there is a link to the Padlet. So if you could do that perhaps after the time, if you've got like 5 minutes just to put some thoughts in, I will be able to then revisit those and pick them up and get your feedback. And I would really appreciate that if you do have 5 minutes or so to fill those in, but we won't do the breakout room aspect of that. Last thing before I want to move on to Q&A is, despite me being really passionate, and you may be able to tell me being really passionate about this, dedicating a lot of my time to this work, even though this is not the primary role I have at the university, and looking at how this has been created, it's been years that we've been working on this in the sector now, and in different ways. And are we starting to see limitations? Are we starting to fail the spirit of decolonizing? And some of the questions I have that I'm reflecting on, and I thought you may want to take away and reflect on as well, is are we still watering down decolonizing? So a few years ago, when I was going to some of the initial conferences around decolonizing in the UK, not many of them were, a lot of the talks were not really decolonizing. It was very much EDI and diversity, and it was kind of looped under this idea of decolonizing almost as a buzzword. But conferences I've been to in the past couple of years, so that was probably a few years ago, but in the past, I'd say 24 months or so, the conferences I've been to as a presenter or as a guest, or as an attendee, have moved away from that and have been a bit more targeted specifically around, actually, no, this is decolonizing work, and understanding the difference. But that doesn't mean that we're not watering down in terms of getting people's buy-in to come into the room and have a conversation, to do the work. Do we, I know for a fact we don't start with the heavy stuff straight away, right? And there's a logical reason for that. But are we still watering down what we mean by this? Impact is the big one, right? So is there a relationship between decolonizing the institution and practice and content, and eliminating the ethnicity award gap to graduate outcome improvements? I don't know. I haven't seen the data around that. And this is, again, because the work takes time to have an impact on a student's journey, but equally we do it in pockets, and we don't always evaluate it, and we stop and start. This pilot, again, is one small pilot across the big institution, and then we need to look at what's the future of that pilot, because how's that going to be embedded. So if we wanted to say, well, we've done this pilot, let's look at the impact, but the pilot's that big compared to the institution. So what impact are we looking at here? Institutional confusion. I think a lot of universities have a willingness to decolonize or engage in decolonizing discussions and language and rhetoric. But when you say, right, in practice, this means we change these things in the way we do these and these frameworks, there's a bit more resistance. And so actually, are institutions confused in their own commitment to decolonizing work? Another point of reflection and consideration I've kind of arrived at is, you know, we know this is a huge piece of work. You know, how does that look, and what does that mean for burnout and for well-being for those engaged with it, and all of those questions. I have really struggled in the past 9 months. If you do look at my LinkedIn, you'll see that the majority of my posts moved away from education and purely about Palestine. Again, I've got a link to that. My wife is from Gaza, family from Gaza. My kids are half Palestinian, and I'm from, you know, that part of the world myself. Um, and yet when it came to decolonizing, right, when you've got you know, the most evident example of settler coloniality and colonization is the Israeli settlement projects, right? Which are illegal under international law. And yet, where is that conversation in a lot of the decolonizing conferences and work? All of the people who are posting on decolonizing in social media spaces, very little voice around the Palestine. And that's just one example I'm giving. Obviously, there are others. You know, Sudan, Congo, you've got loads of areas of this. But where are we being fake in this to some extent in terms of applying this to world issues, to our stance as academics and as leaders in spaces? When we're bringing this into the conversations with our students, with colleagues, challenging our own institutions, thinking about some of the encampments, student encampments, to me, you know, that's liberation. Students are there, and yet they're not being met with a lot of support. They're being challenged, or the support's kind of under the radar. So are we being, maybe fake's the wrong word, but are we being sincere in living this value system of embedding and implementing a decolonial approach to knowledge and education and learning and to life? Yeah, so those are the kind of the limitations and reflections that I'm playing around with, and I wanted to share those with you, and maybe you are also playing around with them as well. I am conscious that I have eaten into some of the Q&A time, so I sincerely apologize, but I am happy to stay on an extra 5-10 minutes if there is Q&A. But yeah, I did wanted to share those with you because this is decolonizing through reflexive practice, and I am constantly in trying to embody this myself, even as leading on this work. Looking at the chat, there are a couple of questions. Lucy, if you don't mind, I'll jump into the chat, and then if anyone's got any other questions, then happy to hear them as well. So there's a question about thank you, sorry. There's a question about how far we've moved after the e-course. So as an example, with the Health and Society team, I did it with a subject group. We finished, so they worked on the e-course trimester 1. We did the academic development workshops in trimester 2. In trimester 3 now, I've already had 2 or 3 colleagues reach out from that subject group to say, I'm trying to apply that learning to my content and teaching preparation and design for next year. This is where I'm at. Can I bounce some ideas off you? Can I share my application of that knowledge and that decolonial approach that we covered and see if it's kind of working or if I'm in the right direction? So there is already, just from this pilot with one group, that application. In terms of and then so you know, that's just one pilot group. The students, again, they were really engaged. They want to hear more. I said one of the outputs was they came on to do the podcast so they can share their experience more widely. But then there was also that feedback which we're going to take back into SLT, you know, and meet with them about, okay, this is what we did. This is the feedback from the students. How do we widen that out for our student pilot, for example? So there are things that we've moved on in this space, and this is in year. Bearing in mind the pilot hasn't actually kind of finished yet because it goes till August. So even within that space, we have moved a bit. And then the evaluation is ongoing, and I want to do that qualitative study where I'm really pulling out some of those deeper perceptions and experiences, which will then feed into next steps. And I'm having conversations with the senior leaders who are sponsoring this pilot about, okay, if we can't do it this way, what do we do next, and how do we manage that resource as well? or how do we tap on resources from other spaces to carry on that work? And there is a willingness to do it, and there is a comfortability now and an awareness. So there are all of those benefits, a huge way to go. And bearing in mind, this is not completely new because it is building on stuff we started 2022. But then what the other thing I'd say about this as well, you've got things like staff changes, right? So if you've got a subject group or a department and you lose 30 to 50% of your staff over 2 or 3 years, and they were the staff who are kind of leading some of that work internally, building on the work that you've done with them, unless you're consistent in helping new starters in your institution tap into this e-course and this work, you're almost going to be setting people up to do well. And then if they leave to go somewhere else, you're getting new people in who maybe haven't experienced that yet. So you have to kind of start again. So these are challenges we're facing as well. But the e-course, what I'd say to that is, because it's now an e-course, and because as you've seen how it works, it's better equipped to help new starters with that work. And it's just us thinking institutionally about what does that look like. And those are conversations I'm having now. Yes, thank you, Lena, as well. Can other institutions use or buy this e-course? Okay, so I finished creating at the end of last academic year. We rolled out this academic year in that pilot, as I said. For the next academic year, I'm looking to widen it out to my institution, but personally, I see no reason why there couldn't be a discussion about access, whether it's using or buying it. I couldn't speak to a purchase or a cost of that because I didn't fund it myself. So content creation versus the people who fund it. But I'm happy to have those conversations if you are interested about accessing that e-course in any way and for your institution. I'm happy to take those conversations back into my senior leaders who have sponsored this, and discuss what that might look like. So yeah, if you're interested, please reach out to me. I'll put my email in the chat and said I'm happy to continue the conversation. Wondering whether any resources, the PDF and the e-course. Oh, that's the same question, just a different person. So yeah, so that's the thing, and exactly right. The concept of mathematics and hard science and not being applied, because this is set up as decolonizing through reflexive practice and it challenges the identity and all of those different areas, it can still be applied. You will still find more resistance, I think, with people coming from certain subject areas, even though we're setting up as decolonizing through reflexive practice. But you do have an easier way of starting, because you're saying, look, content's one aspect, so let's put your content on the side. There are all these other things to this approach of decolonizing through reflexive practice you need to engage with. Let's start with those, please, and here's the e-course to help you. What is useful, though, is that when you start to look at the workshop side, and then you can start to speak more specifically around the discipline, because obviously e-course being what it is, it's not covering every discipline in the world. It's looking at the academic practice side. If you then go into the workshops, where I then look at, okay, what's the subject group I'm working with now? Let's get some examples for maths, whatever it might be, HR, whatever it might be. What does this look like? So one of the conversations I remember having actually with a colleague when I was running the workshops for the HR group was the difference between EDI in HR. So for example, trying to get more women and females into CEO positions, that's kind of like an EDI agenda. A decolonial approach would be questioning the definition and role of a CEO in the first place, and how it was created, how it was defined, who it benefits. So rather than trying to mold more women to fit essentially what is a male created role for society that was dominated by men, okay, why are we doing that? Why aren't we just reimagining what a CEO is, and whether it's needed and how it's needed and what it looks like? And then you're not trying to get a group of people to fit this role, you're getting the role to fit the people. And that's just one example of the kind of the conversations that you can kind of have whilst unpacking again that point of power and where does this idea come from, and challenging the structures themselves. So the workshops are useful, is the point I'm getting at. When you're applying it to different disciplines, you will still find difficulty in maths and science, I think. But then if you're thinking about computer and maths, it's about, okay, how is that being used? Yeah. So if you think about missile systems, and all those things, or you think about anything really linked to computer technology, innovation, and tech. It's you can look at the usage of it. Who benefits from it? Who has the capital? Who's got the intellectual property? How are we still seeing exploitation of people taking those intellectual leaders from the global south and pushing them into the global north, not for the benefit of their own spaces or to develop the global south, but to actually exploit that knowledge for their own? And we've seen that for decades, and we're still seeing it. So these are questions that we can ask and unpack, and think about the application of knowledge, and what is knowledge, and where does that power sit, and what are the influences. So yes, I think they're the questions in the chat. Are there any other questions, or anyone else? Again, I'm very sorry we have just gone slightly over time, but I'm happy to answer any other questions you may have. I can't see any questions. I will put my email in the chat in case you didn't want to ask any here, because it's recorded, that we did say at the beginning. That's my email. I'm happy for you to reach out to me directly. I'm sure the amazing team at Birmingham City University and DMU are going to be sharing this and releasing the recording. Also, feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn, and happy to have a conversation with anybody about this work as well. So thank you very much.